Good evening, and welcome to Game Over. It's kind of grim, but I promise you, we're going to be going over some prophecies from the Bible that are really ultimately impactful to every single human being that is living today and who has ever lived and ever will live. It's a big claim, I know, but we're going to see that as we go through this presentation. And on the note of grimness, of course, the first presentation I've entitled The End of the World, right? So how many of you know that the world is messed up, right? Yeah, the world is messed up. We have politicians that have failed us, right? We've got greed that has caused us to sell our souls to corporations, right? In fact, all of us here are being impacted by only a handful of corporations, right? If we talk about Google and Microsoft and Apple, and guess what? Most of them also happen to be American. And we will see later, not tonight and not tomorrow night, but eventually you're going to see that that actually has prophetic importance. There's a bit of a ringing going on in the audio, Jordan, if you can figure that out. Maybe just kill the monitor here. Goodness and virtues are fast disappearing. And again all you have to do is turn on Netflix, or Disney Plus, or any of the other streaming services you choose, Amazon, you name it, right? And we're going to see front and center lust and pride and greed and envy and gluttony, and it's all being displayed proudly as if these are good things, when in times past, in generations past, these things were seen as sins. They were seen as wrong things. They were seen as things that we shouldn't be doing. And yet instead today, these things are being celebrated as if they're virtues. And I promise you, of course, they are not, right? 2 Timothy 3 predicted this exact state. 2 Timothy 3 verses 1-5, we read, it says, "But realize this, that in the last days, difficult times will come, for men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power. Avoid such men as these." Now, if you go through this entire list, not only do you see this entire list in society as a whole, unfortunately, you also see it in the people that are claiming to be Christians. And it has sadly caused a lot of people to lose faith in God and lose faith in church because they look at this and they say, what bunch of hypocrites. And God predicted this in His Word, in the New Testament. And the church has failed to be the moral voice it should be. And I don't have to go too far into talking about priestly sexual abuses or pastors that are guilty of sexual abuse or money that has been swindled or other things that are going on in the church that a lot of people point to as reasons why they can ignore church. And I'm here to tell you that this is all part of a master plan. And there are reasons for this. We're going to get into those reasons. If you're patient with me, we're building a foundation here, okay? There's multiple, as you guys have already seen. If you're here, I'm assuming you've seen our handbills. We've got 13 presentations. So I hope that you will withhold, judgment as to whether you understand it all until you've had a chance to see it all, okay? But we're building a foundation. And we're building that foundation. We're going to be using the book of Daniel as our foundation. Then we're going to go into other parts of the Bible as it need be, but we're going to be able to show that all that is happening has been foreseen by God, has been also not surprised to God, and that God has a plan, and He is going to see His true followers through to the end. How many of you want to be able to know the plan that God has for this world? Yes, amen, absolutely. So, the world is fast losing faith in God. And this is a number of the nones, for instance, those who believe in no religion, is increasing every year. Every year. It used to be, in a couple generations ago, that pretty much 95% of people went to church, some kind of church. If you didn't go to church, then people looked down on you because they thought there's something wrong with you if you're not going to church. And now, unfortunately, especially in Canada, we're becoming so secularized that it's actually unique or unusual if a person goes to church today. And part of that is because people have lost faith in God. Not in God, the real God. They've lost faith in the fake God, in the false God, in the twisted version of God that most people think they know. The God they think they know, the God that has been portrayed by false Christianity, and who God actually is, are two different beings. I will actually go so far as to say that the being that everybody's rejecting is actually the one who has been masquerading since the beginning as God, which is actually the one you might know him as Satan or the devil. He has painted God with the brush that belongs to him. You guys ever dealt with a narcissist like that? Right? It's like there's a saying about emotional vampires. Emotional vampires, when they look at themselves in the mirror, cannot see their own reflection. Right? Just like a real vampire, Satan is that way. He is the other thing that emotional vampires will do is they will project onto the other person the characteristics that they themselves have. And they will gaslight you into thinking that that's what you have, when in reality, that's the behavior they have been doing. And that's the ultimate masterful job of gaslighting that has happened in this world, is the gaslighting job that Satan has done on the world, to make the world believe that God is a tyrant and God is a person who is not worth following, who is vengeful, who is hurtful, who is angry and just kind of all twisted into a pretzel kind of viewpoint, a malformed beast, Frankenstein, if you will, version of God, such that I don't blame people for rejecting that kind of God. We're going to see that God isn't actually anything like that as we progress through this seminar. Luke 18:8, these are the words of Jesus himself. He says, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? So why is planet Earth full of wicked people? Romans 3 gives us a clue. Verses 10 to 12, it says, as it is written, there is none righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is none who seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they become useless. There is none who does good. There is not even one. Kind of a discouraging picture in a certain sense, but it's actually paradoxical in the sense, right? It's like not what you expect. It's as we embrace the fact that you and I, on our own, without God, have nothing good, and that all goodness actually comes from God, doesn't come from us, then that liberates us. It frees us from all of our messiness. How many people here have screwed up in their life? Right? Anyone who doesn't lift up their hand to that is lying, right? We've all screwed up. Some of us more so than others, right? But the point is we are all unworthy. If we are held to the righteous, perfect demands or law of God, all of us are unworthy. But the good news is God doesn't hold that against us. He's made a plan for that. Why? Because exactly what we're reading here, what we read here is the fact that there is no one who's good, and therefore we need God. We need help. So how can we get out of this mess that we are in? And that's where the book of Daniel comes in, all right? Daniel is a special book. Daniel is a book that was written over 2,500 years ago, almost 2,600 years ago, but it was written as a word from God for the end of time. And it is especially relevant for us today, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. A book that was written 2,000, almost 600 years ago, could be one that actually speaks to our world today. In times past, in ancient times, anything that was old was valued, and anything was new was mistrusted. And of course, today we're exactly the opposite, right? Anything that's brand new is trusted, and everything that is old is distrusted. We want the latest thing, the latest findings, the latest scientific findings. We want, what's the current research? What's the current understanding? What's the newest thing? But really, there is nothing new under the sun. Solomon said that. There's nothing new that you and I could invent. And the wisdom actually is found in the ancient. And I'd especially say that this is true when it comes to the Word of God. Daniel's day saw Judah conquered because of their many sins. And the church in its day, I want to call it the church, but of course it was the Jews in those days, was not doing his job or living for God. God had intended the Jerusalem to be a light on a hill, to be a beacon of hope for the whole world. He had intended it to bless the Jewish people so much that the rest of the world would come to them to learn and to understand what they were doing and why they were getting blessed. Of course, if we know our history, it's been twisted in certain ways where people get mad and angry, right? And want to get rid of the Jews because they look at the blessing the Jews have received and they get jealous and envious of that blessing. The reason the Jewish people have had a blessing is because of the fact that they have followed God. To the measure they follow God is the measure that they have a blessing. But unfortunately, the Jewish people didn't live up to the fullness of what God had called them to do. And in 2 Chronicles 36, we see this description. It says, the Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them again and again by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they continually mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, until there was no remedy. Therefore he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans. Chaldean, you'll find out, we'll say that a lot, is actually another word for Babylon. The king of Babylon, who slew their young men with a sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or infirm. He gave them all into his hand. So why did God permit Judah to be conquered by Babylon? Judah was the kingdom of God. It was the kingdom that God had ordained. God had promised. You could go in places, I don't have it up on the screen, but Deuteronomy 28, for instance, or Leviticus 26, you will find in those curses and blessings. And God had promised in those blessings that he would protect them, and he would guide them, and he would keep them from all harm. Any army that came against them, he would defeat. But if it's interesting, if you go to Deuteronomy 28, the chapter itself has somewhere around 80 verses. 15 of those verses have to do with blessing, and like 60 of them have to do with curses. And if you read through those curses, God promised them that he would chase them after the sword, and he would destroy them completely. That's the final result. If they didn't turn, if they didn't listen to his voice. And unfortunately, in Judah's case, they had king after king after king who disobeyed him. And ultimately, out of 20 kings that they had in a row, only 8 of them did what was right. So 12 of them were doing what was wrong. That I don't even get into the kingdom of Israel, because the kingdom of Israel was so wicked at some point that God allowed the Assyrians to just take them away and scatter them all over the earth. Where today, the Jews that we have today, are basically coming from the tribe of Judah or the tribe of Benjamin. Because all the other 10 tribes, they got scattered to the wind by the king of Assyria. And so this happened before at this point of Babylon, and now Judah is going the same way as Israel, and God is bringing judgment upon them. I just want you to notice these words that I've highlighted here. We've got they continually mocked the messenger of God. They despised his words. They scoffed at his prophets until there was no remedy. So this is the thing. When we come to truth, will we listen? Will we learn? When we find out something's not working, will we ask why? Will we be willing to seek after God? I mean, God's like a good father. And I'll tell you something. If you have a father who never disciplines their children, what do you think is going to happen to the children? Right? Will they grow up to be productive members of society? No, children do need some discipline. Now, of course, sometimes fathers go too far in a sinful world. Absolutely. God, of course, is perfect, and so he always does the right thing. So God looks and he seeks to bring consequence into the picture in order for people to learn. And you think about it, right? If things are going easy, if things are going well, how much do you learn? Not usually much. But when things are going bad and you fail, if you have the tenacity to try again, and you fail, and you'd have the tenacity to try it again, what do? Each time in your failure, you learn. And God was trying to do this with Judah. Now, let me ask you this. Has the church today lived up to the light it has received? I would say the answer to that is no, sadly. The church back then, or the Jews back then, and the church today are deceived by humanity's greatest enemy. And that greatest enemy is, Satan. Satan is described in the Bible as the great serpent, the devil, who hated God, who turned from God. He was originally an angel of light. He was originally worshiping God at the throne of God, and he turned from God. And in the process, he brought a third of the angels along with him. And then that wasn't enough, but he waged war here on earth, and he's still waging war here on earth. You talk about alien invasion. Guess what? Satan wasn't born here on this earth. He's actually an alien. You could call him an interdimensional alien who's able to move through physical space and also through what we would call the spiritual dimension in the Bible. And so therefore he can be standing right here and we can't see him, touch him, feel him, whatever. And that's unfortunately why people, scientists, they say, well, we can't measure God. We can't see God. Therefore God must not exist. I would submit to you, it doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. It could just mean that we don't have the tools to be able to measure him, that he exists. Now, how can we avoid a similar fate of falling into error? Well, this is where we find Daniel at the beginning of this book. At the beginning of the book, Daniel and his friends are being marched into captivity because the king of Babylon has come and grabbed them forcefully. We're going to read some of Daniel here in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. You ready? If you do have Bibles, then you're welcome to read it in your favorite version. Otherwise, we've got it here so it's easy to read. Hopefully you can all see it. I'll stand back a little bit so I'm not blocking anyone's way. Sometimes I get anxious and I want to jump into the crowd, so here we go. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. And then the king offered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, he ordered Ashpenaz to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom there was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Right? So here we see the people thought any mention of captivity or hardship was foolish. So when we see this, right, we're seeing Daniel and his friends are being brought into captivity. This is a policy that Babylon of old followed. They would seek to forcibly move populations to Babylon in order to retrain them so that they could be indoctrinated into the Babylonian ways and then be able to basically be assimilated. And so we find, people today who are questioning things. They're questioning God. On seminar, when we advertised this seminar on Facebook, people called this seminar a number of names. Of course, Facebook, the internet's kind of a troll fest anyway, right? But so take it for what it's worth. But a lot of these people are convinced that they're right. And then they call it scam. They call it fake news. They call it a bunch of malarkey, doomsday cult, too much corruption in churches. And people use those words in order to excuse themselves. They don't have to follow it. But like today, people in Daniel's day felt secure in their wickedness. You see, the people of Judah thought that they could just keep doing whatever they were doing. And they didn't realize that they were, it's not that they didn't realize. The prophet Jeremiah, for instance, was sent 40 years before the Babylonian captivity and was warning the people of Israel or Judah for 40 years that this was going to happen. How many of you would like to have a career like that? It's a thankless job. In fact, Ezekiel was another prophet that God sent to Babylon. And God, at the very beginning of Ezekiel, he tells Ezekiel, I'm sending you to your own people, but they're not going to listen to you. But he says, I'm making your forehead like flint. He's like, I'm making you a strong forehead, right? So that you're not going to get insulted or discouraged at this lack of interest. But see, it also showed the mercy of God. None of these Jews that lived in that day, when they faced God in judgment, could say, but God, I didn't know. In fact, if you go into Jeremiah and you read Isaiah and you read Ezekiel, what you find is that Jeremiah, for instance, was persona non grata in the royal court. All he did was give bad news, right? To Zedekiah the king and others. They didn't want to hear him, so they threw him down a well, and they put him in prison, and they shackled him, and they mocked him, and they did everything they could to try to discourage him, and yet he kept coming back. Ezekiel was another case. Ezekiel is one of my favorite prophets, partly because he does some really crazy stuff, right? And one of the things God told him to do is he says, I want you to go and make a hole on the side of your house. He says, don't go out the door, but cut a hole in the side of your house and go out and get yourself a bag, just whatever you can carry. You know, kind of one of those old like knapsacks, like you take a sheet, put everything in a sheet, put it on a stick. You ever seen those, right? You're going, he says, take whatever you can, put it on that stick, sling it over your shoulder, and don't go out your front door, go out that side door, that hole that you just made. I just have this image, right, of God asking us to do that. We're taking an axe, right, to our house. Just to make a hole. People be like, the neighbors would be like, what are you doing? I'm just doing what God asked me to do, right? People be like, wow, you've really lost it, right? The guys with the padded wagon be coming for me, right? And that's just one of the things that God asked Ezekiel to do. But God was prophesying through actions, through the actions of Ezekiel. He was saying the same way that Ezekiel went through that side door and didn't go through the front door, God was going to grab them and they weren't going to be able to take much, and they were going to be taken by force in a direction they didn't want to go. And so, like today, people think they're secure. People think, this is a bunch of mumbo jumbo, like I just read you. Doomsday cult, right? Scam. It's all a hoax. These people are all focused on the negative, right? I mean, even the title, Hope Through the Coming Collapse, right? Or the other title that I have on the beginning of the slides, Hope Through the Coming Deception. Well, you know, Isaiah says this in chapter 47, verses 10 and 11. You felt secure in your wickedness and said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and your knowledge, they have deluded you. For you have said in your heart, I am, and there is no one beside me. Isn't that what people are saying today? There is no God, right? People are saying, I can do whatever I want. Nobody sees me. There's no such thing as a judgment. Right? But evil will come on you, which you will not know how to charm away, and disaster will fall on you for which you cannot atone, and destruction about which you do not know will come on you suddenly. By the way, it's a treacherous thing to be a prophet. Isaiah, according to tradition, was sawed in half. So people don't like to hear bad news, right? What we want to hear is, keep doing whatever you're doing. Everything will be great. Everything will be wonderful. But I think most of us understand that the way society is going right now cannot continue without massive consequences. The way that people are ignoring virtue and running towards what is lewdness and sin and wickedness is not going to be good for society. And God has been erased from society, and there are always consequences to that and hell to pay. Nothing is hidden from God's sight. He literally sees all. Now, I would struggle. I couldn't in language be able to start to describe to you how much more superior God is to all of us, but I'll tell you, I'll just try a little bit, okay? I was in Bangkok, Thailand recently because I married a Filipina and I was in Thailand. And in Thailand, in the city of Bangkok, you have 7 million people. So when you go to downtown Thailand, there's a lot of people walking by at any given point, just masses of people, right? I mean, in Sault Ste. Marie, we're looking to have just one string of people running down a sidewalk. That would be busy, right? But imagine like 3 and 4 shoulders wide of people, right? Just these masses of people. And the thought came to me, God says nothing is hidden from his sight. God says he knows every person in the world. God knows who you are, what you've done, where you've been, where you're ever, what everything you're ever going to do. He knows what you're thinking. He knows what you're about to think. And God can also carry on conversations with his followers simultaneously everywhere, not just on planet Earth, but literally in the universe. And every person he can talk to as if you're the only person he's talking to. Now, you know, when we're talking about God, right, we're talking about a being that is so much more powerful and intelligent and vast than what we are. And for those who are convinced that God doesn't exist, I'll just say this much. I'm not going to go too far into that. I'm kind of assuming that you have a basic belief in God, but I will say this, all right? Who here thinks they have 1% of all the knowledge there is in the world? Okay, what about 0.1%? Anyone willing to admit they have 0.1% of all the knowledge there is in the world? Okay, so if no one's willing to claim even 0.1%, right, of the knowledge of the world, isn't it possible that God exists in that 99.9% of the knowledge you don't know? Isn't it possible? So hopefully we're humble enough, right, not so full of ourselves, to at least allow for the existence, the possibility of existence of God, right? But I promise you, as far as the Bible is concerned, and you will see how God has led in prophecy and how he's outlined what is going to happen. And he's not just outlined what's happening now, but he's telling us where we're going to head. And when you see all of that and you see how it unfolds, you will recognize that God is real. He has a plan, and that plan wants to include every one of us. But if we will not follow him, if we will not surrender ourselves to him, then we will one day have to face the consequences of our choice. Hebrews 4:13 says, "There is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are open and laid bare to the eyes of him with whom we have to do." There's no ocean you could go to where you could get away from him. You couldn't jump in a spaceship and go far enough out into outer space where you wouldn't also encounter him. Nowhere that you and I could go where we wouldn't find him. But fortunately, this massively intelligent being, massively capable being, all-powerful being, fortunately, he is for us, not against us. He loves us, and he wants to save us, and he wants to see us all have everlasting life, eternal life. It's not ever been his plan to punish humanity. Unfortunately, human beings bought into the lie of Satan, and that is what got us all into that mess. But I will also promise you, God's patience is not unlimited. There is coming a day when we, like the Jews of old, Judah, eventually, after all of these prophets God sent, and they mocked them and ignored them. Eventually, God sent Nebuchadnezzar's judgment. The day is coming where he is sending a judgment here to us on planet Earth. So as we continue in Daniel 1, it says, "King appointed for them a daily ration for the king's choice food, and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. And among them were the sons of Judah, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them, and to Daniel he assigned the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, to Azariah Abednego. And disaster will fall on you, which you cannot atone." So their identities were taken from them and their old lives erased. Imagine, right? Far from home, new language, new clothes, new homes, new environment, in chains, walking for 1,000 miles or 1,000 kilometers, right? We don't know, and there's some speculation among commentaries as to whether or not they were castrated, because this was a common thing they did in those days for young men so that they wouldn't rebel and wouldn't cause trouble. We don't know whether that was the case, but you don't have to go that far to know that they were not in a great situation, right? No longer free, dangers everywhere, racism, suspicion, fear. Imagine that whole environment. And how would you react to having everything you know and love ripped away from you? Daniel 1:8 says, but Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself from the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. You see, Jews have very strict dietary laws, and he was determined that he was going to keep his faith the way God had ordained it, even in a pagan environment, in this dangerous environment, this difficult environment. That took a lot of courage, right? Because most of us, if we're putting in a life or death situation, right? You're captive, you've been ripped away, you've just seen all kinds of horrors. Most people would just go along. They would compromise, but not Daniel. Daniel held firm, and he was willing to take a stand, and his friends were with him on it. Takes courage to stand for God in a hostile environment, doesn't it? Daniel, verse 9, it follows. It says, now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. And by the way, in a monarchy is very different than a democracy, okay? If the king's upset, king gets angry, king wants to off you, nobody's going to argue with him, right? And off your head goes. So this commander, some versions call it a eunuch, was afraid, right? If he doesn't give good food to Daniel and his friends, they might get sick, and if they get sick, he might be the one who loses his life for it. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then let our appearance be observed in your presence and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. And so he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days, right? And so, as I already mentioned, what's wrong with the king's food? Well, the king's food, first of all, would have been most likely sacrificed to idols, which is a big problem because Jews aren't supposed to worship idols. So that would have been one problem. And then, of course, the other problem is the food rules of Torah say that clean, what Jews would call clean food and unclean food are not supposed to touch, are not supposed to be served with the same utensils on the same plate, on the same surface. And so even food that would have been kosher or would have looked clean, like a beef or chicken, stuff like that, would not have been prepared properly. And so it would have violated his rules. And so that's why Daniel took this stand to say, no, well, just give me vegetables, because he knew if I had vegetables, I'll be okay. And Daniel and his friends wanted to stay true to God no matter the cost. They put their life on the line. It was a small thing, but it was an important thing. They stood up for their faith in a hostile environment. That's not easy to do. I mean, any of us here who have a faith in God, it's not easy to admit to it in this world. We're in a post-Christian world where people here in Canada will often make fun of us because of our faith, right? And think less of us because of our faith. It takes courage to be able to stand up and say, no, I'm sorry, but I still believe in God. You may think it's foolish or stupid, but I believe in God. Are we as willing to stand against the injustices and evils of this world as Daniel and his friends were? To stand true to God no matter what? Luke 16:10 says, he who is faithful in a very little things is also faithful in much. And he who is unrighteous in very little things is unrighteous also in much. So even though this might on one side seem like a small thing, following the dietary laws, they were a seed that was planted. It was a stand that prepared them for the trials to come. And as we go through the book of Daniel, you're going to see they face some major trials. And they weren't willing to compromise here on the small things, which prepared them to be able to be ready to take a stand for the big things. That makes sense? There is a time of trouble coming upon the world, and it's coming soon. And this time of trouble will usher in the end of time. And when this end of time comes, then when the last person who is going to accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior has made that decision, when that last person has said yes to Jesus and there's no new person who's going to come to him, then The end will come. The gospel of this kingdom, Matthew 24:14 says, will be preached in all the world as a witness, and then the end will come. Little things matter. If we can't stay true to our faith in a time and in a place where we don't have to give up our life, right? Here in Canada, we're not going to lose our life for being a Christian. Some places in the world you will, but not in Canada. We're not willing to stand up and be counted for God now. Whatever makes us think we're going to be able to do it when all hell breaks loose. We need to learn how to do it now. Take those steps now. Daniel, we continue in Daniel, and it says, so he listened to them in this matter. That's the commander of the officials, and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. And as for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. Then at the end of the days which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king. And the king talked with them, and out of them all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. And as for every matter of wisdom and understanding upon which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. Did God bless those 4 for their stand? Yes. And God gave them special wisdom and understanding and protection and guidance. And it was so powerful of a blessing on them that the king himself recognized no one was even close to these 4. God blessed these 4 boys, right? And they were rewarded for their faithfulness. The question I ask you is, do you think God would really destroy the world? Well, Genesis chapter 6, we find the first time God did it. It says here, the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he grieved in his heart. And the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Right? So why did God decide to destroy the earth? Because of its wickedness. It got to the point that there was one righteous man left on earth. And that's why God had to act. If he didn't act, that one man would be gone. And then what? The whole world would be wicked. And so God had to act. And God is going to do that again. How can God be love and yet destroy the world? Right? Well, because God is also justice and holiness and righteousness. God is about what is right and what is good. He's about making every wrong right. Right now, it seems like God's not in control at times because wickedness is allowed to run its course, but it's not going to continue forever. The day is coming soon where that's going to come to an end because God is allowing it only for a time and for a season in order to demonstrate to the world and to the universe the fact that sin, disobedience, or lawlessness against God always leads to chaos and ultimately to the murder of God himself, which happened through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Genesis 6:11-14 says, the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. And then God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them, and behold, I'm about to destroy them with the earth. Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood, and you shall make the ark with rooms, and shall cover it inside and out with pitch. Now, this story is fascinating. I'm not going to get into it more than I just did now. If when you get home, you take your Bible, you read Genesis 6, it's a really interesting story. 6, 7, and 8 describes the fact that the entire earth got covered with so much water that there was 20 feet above the highest mountain. The water didn't just come from the top, it came from the deep as well, and it covered the earth. But God will not give grace to the wicked forever. Now, he has promised, and if you read in Genesis, he promises he's not going to destroy the world again by a flood. But that doesn't mean that he's not going to destroy the world again. It means, what I wanted to do and bring this up is to tell you that God is capable of this. And so we must not treat God like a fool and not think that we can just keep doing whatever we want because God's just going to leave us alone. No, the day is coming. The day of judgment is coming, and we must be ready. Revelation 22, the words of Jesus himself. He says, "Behold, I am coming quickly, and my reward is with me to render to each man according to what he has done." And verses 13 to 15, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Blessed are those who wash their robes, so that they may have right to the tree of life and may enter through the gates of the city. Outside are the dogs and the sorcerers and the immoral persons and the murderers and idolaters and everyone who loves and practices lying." The day is coming, folks, when God is going to come and he's going to say, "Enough, it is finished." And he is going to institute righteousness on the earth once and for all. So where are we in Earth's history? Well, how soon before Jesus comes back to earth? I'm glad you asked. That's in the next presentation. Presentation 2, who knows the future?